Okay, so now we are talking about the century of the Enlightenment. That's the 18th century, the 1700s. And the real center of the action during that century, the century of the Enlightenment, was Paris. Paris was the place to be. And we will do, I think the next video I'll do will be a political history of France in the 18th century. Today we're doing intellectual history of France in the 18th century. But in any event, the important thing to remember is that this century, the 18th century, the 1700s, the Enlightenment we call it, the rise of empirical science, this century is a revolutionary century. At the end of the century, everything goes boom. And in particular, in 1789, you get the French Revolution. So one of the things that we're thinking about today is cultural aspects and philosophical aspects of the French Revolution and leading up to the French Revolution. We're going to look at four figures of the French intellectual scene in the 18th century. It was quite a scene. There are very many people. There's all kinds of stuff going on. We call these people the Philosophes. I don't just call it French philosophy because they weren't really what we would call philosophers, or necessarily even what people at the time would call philosophers. The Philosophes were people who wrote poems, plays, novels, a lot of letters. They made a lot of speeches. They wrote essays. They wrote a lot of different things. And some of the most important writings are in the forms of novels and plays and things rather than in formal philosophy. So we call them the Philosophes because you're looking at their attitude. They are people who are bringing together a lot of elements of culture and so on. And I think one of the real takeaways, in fact, from them and from Voltaire, the first person we'll look at, is this coming together, the sort of politicization of philosophy isn't something that was always sort of there. We were talking about the 17th century and that transitional role of theology. And I think we see then in the 18th century, philosophy really sort of moves in some sectors of philosophy, let's be fair, move from thinking of themselves as more or less allied with those religious ideas, theological ideas, and coming to see philosophy as more identified with the movement of natural science. Of course, that's an issue that still goes on today. That's an issue that a lot of you are engaged in when you write me your reports even, and you talk about your upbringings and stuff. All right, so the thing about the 18th century, the 1700s, the whole place is really infused with tension because you know that these revolutions, the United States Revolution of 1776 and the Haitian Revolution of 1804, we'll get to that, happen at the end of this century. And when we're looking at everything that's happening, sort of, as we'll say in the move from Louis XIV, sort of all-powerful Baroque king of France, certainly the most powerful person in France, to the overthrow of his grandnephew, Louis XVI in 1789. This was a mind-blowing thing for people because France was the Bourbon War Room in Versailles was the center of military planning for Europe, for wars that spread around the whole periphery of Europe. And by the way, too, if in 18th century France, let me even step out just for a second for this. I mean, you know, France was the center of culture. That phrase lingua franca, you know, the universal language, around 1750, certainly, if you were an educated person or a classy person, or in anywhere in the world, certainly from Russia or from England, to say nothing of Central Europe or Africa or the colonies, you spoke French. I mean, you were expected to speak French. People like David Hume and Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson didn't show up in Enlightenment Paris and go to the salons and the parties and speak English to people. No, those people all spoke French because that was just expected of you. If you were an educated person in the middle of the 1700s, you spoke French. It was the language of diplomacy. It was the language of literature. It was the sort of, as they say, the sort of lingua franca, the language that everyone used. And France was the preeminent military power and really at odds with just about everybody else too. And constantly amazing expenditures on for the French army. So the idea that that entity, this massive super state in the middle of Europe, the culturally most powerful engine in the world, would be overthrown by revolutionaries, anti-monarchical, and in fact, to some extent, explicitly anti-church, not necessarily anti-Christian revolutionaries. In a bloody revolution, by the way, where many executions were carried out, including the execution of the king, Louis XVI, and his consort, Marie Antoinette. She actually was executed about a year after him. He was executed very soon afterwards. So, all right, so let's get back to our slides. Having made that point about the enormity of this event in 1789 that completely shook the world and had reverberations out to the horizon. The story is that Henry Kissinger asked the Chinese leader Zhou Enlai what he thought of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution in the 1970s, and Zhou Enlai responded to Henry Kissinger, "It's too soon to tell." Anyway, a big event. And of course, the other thing, speaking as, again, your teacher, if I am, 1789 is one of those big dates. Notice that it's exactly 100 years after Newton publishes the Principia. 1789 is a big landmark. It's like if in the middle of your backyard there was a big shade tree growing that dominated the whole yard. 1789 is the historical date, sort of equivalent of that. There's before it, there's after it. Everything's vascular with it. Everything's got to do with the French Revolution. So I understand that one of the things about history that people think of as daunting is the idea that you would actually just know a date. But some dates you know them not because you would just memorize things, but because they just make sense and they fit in systematically with everything else. And 1789 is one of those dates. Okay. After that, you really just don't have even the ruling classes of Europe, the titled tribes of Europe aren't really what they're still around today, but they were never the same after that. And meanwhile, it's Paris, the capital, the city, where all of the revolutionary ferment, all of the revolutionary cultural and intellectual activity is happening, right in the shadow of the king and the king's regime, right there. So Paris is really the place to be in the middle of the 1700s. Now, we want to talk a little bit more about this issue of where they stand with God. David Hume is pretty much an out-and-out atheist, and he's pretty much an out-and-out atheist because of his empiricism. He just takes that fairly obvious, straightforward implication of empiricism that if you don't have evidence, sensory evidence for something, it's something that probably doesn't exist. And Hume will sit with that. Now, remember, France is a Catholic country, and a big part of the Enlightenment is challenging the authority of the church. And the church and the cardinals of the church are also deeply involved with the French government and with running things for the monarchy. So, so religion is a very, very highly charged issue. There is persecution of religious sects happening in France at this time and other things. So it's a hot button issue. What were the deists? Essentially this, you probably, I'm sure I don't need to explain to you too much about the design argument. That's the idea that there is actually some evidence for the existence of God when we look at the design and functionality of nature, that nature appears to have a designer. Now that's a philosophical issue, and I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about that in philosophical terms right now. What we're trying to do right now is understand these Enlightenment philosophes in Paris. And remember Spinoza. Spinoza was worrying as a rationalist in the 17th century. Spinoza was wondering about this relationship between the logical necessity of mathematics and the apparent contingency of nature. And Spinoza decided that everything was God. And part of that was when Spinoza said that nature was God and God was nature, was that Spinoza sort of consecrated nature and said that studying nature was sort of a sacrament. And that was either what was shocking or what was wonderful about Spinoza, depending on, what you make of him. But this deism is similar to that. This deism rests on teleology, the study of function, and says you look at nature and you see the work of God. So one thing about deism is that it reconciles worship with science. In fact, properly construed, as I think Spinoza construed it, and these folks as well. Certainly Thomas Jefferson saw it this way. Studying nature, doing science, is actually celebrating God. In fact, Newton, the ultimate physicist, who was also deeply involved in theology and religion, said himself, it's from Newton where we get that phrase, to reveal the face of God. Newton thought that when he was putting together his mathematical descriptions of the forces, that what he was doing was revealing the face of God. So that's the first point about deism. 2 points about deism. Point number 1, deism reconciles worship with science and looking at nature. Point number 2, the negative side of deism. Deism says, look, divine revelation is false. I mean, we don't have some sort of, remember, the Enlightenment scientist doesn't like speculative metaphysics, doesn't like superstition and religion, wants to use natural scientific methods and to sort of get that across the board. So divine revelation's out, but that's a very potent thing. Remember, the Bible is the book of God. The Bible's divine revelation. And when the priest gives a sermon and we respect the authority of the priest, that's because the priest is appointed by the church. These don't have anything to do with arguments or science. So the second point about deism is, the first point is that deism tries to reconcile religious devotion with science, mostly on the side of science, I think. And I think that's true with Spinoza too. After all, I mean, it's for you to judge. The second point is extremely barbed product, combination of influences from the Protestant Reformation and from the scientific revolution against the church. I mean, and the ultimate embodiment of that was Voltaire. I mean, Voltaire really saw a big part of his project as sort of deprogramming people from the church and religion. As for, you'll hear in the United States, sometimes you'll hear various political forces, mostly right-wing political forces, saying that the people who wrote the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all these people, Alexander Hamilton, were evangelical Christians. No, wrong. They were these deists, and in fact, they were people like the French, and that's where they got it from, because after all, they were triangulated, just as the Scottish. Remember Hume? There's a status issue between Scotland and England at that time too, and these Americans and Scottish English-speaking people are triangulated from the English, who are sort of their political oppressors, and they tend to be aligned with and inspired by and admiring of the French. So that's where they're getting it from. And they're certainly not evangelical Christians. That's an outrageous, misleading thing to say, but I digress. So Voltaire, as I said, Voltaire, the ultimate symbol of the French Revolution. The thing about Voltaire is that you have to understand historically is that Voltaire became in the French mind, in the popular French mind, at the end of the century, at the end of the 18th century, and after his death, even more so, Voltaire came in people's minds to be the embodiment of Frenchness, of the French spirit, of the modern Frenchman. He played a role in that, obviously, and he knew what he was doing. Voltaire was a great intellectual propagandist. He would get these ideas and tie them together and push them. He came from an upper class family. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. He went off to Paris, where he did extremely well for himself, by the way, against his father's wishes. And again, lucky for him, he's someone who always seemed to turn bad luck into good. In his late 20s, a nobleman, an aristocrat, sued him for libel. Not surprisingly, when we get to some of the stuff that he said, and he had to go to England for a few years, to London for a few years, where he was friends with Jonathan Swift, and he met all the leading luminaries of the day, and soaked up a lot of the Newtonian science, this new scientific attitude, and took it back to France. So that's another thing. Voltaire is kind of a carrier of these Enlightenment ideas from the scientific revolution in its Newtonian English incarnation back to Paris. And he picks up on the idea that Descartes is sort of the symbol of rationalist religiosity. And he picks up on the idea that the rationalist movement of the 17th century was, as I've been explaining too, a movement that was a theological movement in many ways, a movement that was interested in the concept of God. And so Voltaire, again, puts together this idea that, well, Newtonian naturalism, modernism, the Enlightenment, versus Descartes rationalism, Catholicism, religion. And then he gets, and he anticipates a lot of later liberal Enlightenment values. Personal liberty. Voltaire always, he had a bad encounter too with a nobleman as a young man that smarted him. So much of this stuff is personal, as we'll see when we get also to some of these other people. The pursuit of happiness, more technically hedonism not meaning sybaritic pursuit of pleasure, but hedonism being the ethical theory that value ultimately comes from simple happiness rather than from something more transcendental. And then we'll see the English, like the utilitarians, carrying on with that kind of idea. And in general, naturalism, that again, Voltaire really soaks this up in England when he's learning about Newton. Skepticism about superstition, religion. And so this kind of worldly stance is something that came to be identified with Voltaire. Voltaire came to be kind of the face of the cultural revolution, if you will, in the culture wars that attended the larger French Revolution. Voltaire was sort of the leading revolutionary face, right? The one that sort of symbolized, and he had to spend a great deal of his life outside of France. And he chose to spend a lot of his life outside of France. And he dies in 1778. The revolutionary government in 1791 sets up a pantheon of heroes, still there today in Paris. And the first one to be interred there is Voltaire. Now, here's the thing, though. That's not just ratifying that Voltaire was a great man and so he's buried in the pantheon. Rather, the point is that years after his death, right, when they were thinking of the pantheon, 13 years after the death of Voltaire, there was agreement, well, the first person that should go in was Voltaire. So that's more a point about the French themselves, the French sort of national attitude, national identity, than it is about Voltaire himself. It's the role that Voltaire played in the French mind, I think, that's the most important thing about him. We can understand some more about him now that we've got that outline. He's known for this novel Candide. Remember, Leibniz objected to Spinoza because Spinoza said the universe was the mind and body of God and therefore perfect, but Leibniz objected that meant that there was no moral decision made by God. God was not an intentional moral agent. So Leibniz suggested that it must be that God had chosen the best of all possible worlds, and in that act, God had committed a moral act and been a moral, intentional being. Well, and so then Leibniz says this is the best of all possible worlds, which also explains the problem of evil, so Leibniz thought, because you could always say, well, I know about the earthquakes and the toothaches and everything, but, it's the best we could do. It was for chocolate and, joy that we had to have, earaches. So, that's the kind of argument there. So, of course, Voltaire just thinks that's all hooey, and Voltaire understands that the rationalist movement in philosophy is part of what you have to go after if you're going after the sort of cultural edifice of the church and religious society. So in Candide, Dr. Pangloss and Candide are going around and they're getting, they're in the earthquake in Lisbon and they're covered with sores and they're getting the plague. And Dr. Pangloss keeps saying this is the best of all possible worlds. So that novel, Candide, is Voltaire's attack on rationalism. Okay, so, and then you'll always see in popular culture the witty Frenchman with the sharp tongue. He's very arch, he's very worldly, he's very knowing, he's a raconteur, he's out on the town. And that stereotype of the worldly cultured Frenchman is one, really the archetype of that is Voltaire. He fashioned himself that way, and he modeled this sort of modern vision of the Enlightenment Frenchman. Not so well known today, but maybe as in his own way as influential as Montesquieu, who published The Spirit of Laws in 1748. He was a judge, he was a diplomat. He also was a well-educated person. The last two people we'll see with not quite this pedigree. But Montesquieu was very forward-looking, and in The Spirit of Laws in 1748, for one thing, the idea that, and we see this already in Hobbes, remember, in the Leviathan, this idea that the only thing that really legitimates any regime is that it somehow benefits the people, at a minimum by protecting their physical security. Right. It's when the government is no longer benefiting the people, even unto death, and then the people don't have any reason to be loyal to the government. And so Montesquieu is establishing constitutional, what's happening in the end of the 17th century, in the 1600s in England, you have a temporary overthrow of the monarchy, and you do have then some constitutional law. So now Montesquieu is sort of ratifying that here. You could have a monarchical republic, of course, that protected the people. But Montesquieu thinks there has to be kind of a ruling idea or value of a people. And he thinks the only way that a monarchy or something like a monarchy can survive is if the people love honor, the honor that you get within the hierarchy that's established by the monarchy. And then democracy, he associated with love of virtue. And that is an interesting point in Montesquieu, because the reason that Montesquieu thinks that a public, a people, a nation must share the value of love of virtue is because Montesquieu thinks that what democracy is all about is putting the interests of the collective, or perhaps the interests of the generic citizen, if you wish, in front of one's own particular contingent desires and interests. So I think that's a striking view of what democracy means. Democracy is really, according to Montesquieu, an exercise in a kind of value that's altruistic. And a lot of people wouldn't. You could explain the social contract as something that I was interested in solely because it benefited me, even though it meant me sort of relinquishing certain rights and taking on certain responsibilities in order to live peaceably with everybody else. But the idea, Hobbes's idea, would be that that was so that I could live peaceably. I got something out of it. And Montesquieu agrees that's certainly true, but Montesquieu says, look, a democratic society is going to have a shared value of love of being virtuous, of being the virtuous person who says, I'll sacrifice, I'll do it. He says, otherwise democracy is not going to work. So Montesquieu rejects the idea of a completely self-interested basis for a democratic society. Hume thinks that you could have a completely self-interested democratic society. And Montesquieu gives another idea, which is separation of powers. And that is a fairly radical idea. Again, a monarchical society is precisely that you don't have separation of powers, and precisely the argument for a monarchical or any kind of authoritarian fascist society or communist society is that you're going to have one entity moving forward, making the decisions, and that's going to be efficient. And tyranny is efficient, but Montesquieu said what protects individuals the individual person from the king or the junta or whatever the ruling engine is separation of powers, and then separation of powers is going to have to be granted by a constitution. Look at that again, that the connection between Hobbes's notion of political sovereignty as guaranteeing the peace and the evolution of the constitutional basis of government. That constitution then is that sovereign thing that in terms that we both signed on to it. So we both have agreed, and it's the document, what the document says, that is ultimately sovereign. So the Constitution is a way of putting ultimate sovereignty outside of the hands of any individual person. As I said at the beginning, Montesquieu is not as well known today outside of people who study political theory and political history, but The Spirit of Law is a tremendously influential book. It was at hand, frequently cited, both by the people in the late 18th century in North America who were working on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, a huge fan of Montesquieu, literally with the book on his desk. But Simón Bolívar also literally had his copy, like carrying around his copy of Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws during the Wars of Spanish Succession in the 19th century in South America as well, where those also, we have those constitutional republics. The three big Republican revolutionary countries from the Enlightenment revolutions. So again, look, you can say Cuba or Russia or China are communist or socialist revolutionary countries rooted in the beginning of the 20th century. The United States and France are Republican revolutionary countries rooted in the Republican revolutions against monarchy at the end of the 18th century. And that's still also very clear in the public political thinking in both countries. The fourth one is Haiti, a genuine, authentic Republican Enlightenment revolutionary country from 1804 and has been independent ever since. And then after that, in the 19th century, the Bolivarian republics in South America are also examples of constitutional republics, all based on the model that we get from Spirit of Laws by Montesquieu in 1748, which also influences Adam Smith and everybody else. So although not on the lips of everybody who could mention to you Voltaire and Rousseau today, nonetheless, Montesquieu, certainly one of the very most influential of these 18th century philosophers. The fascinating Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is a piece of work, who has a complex life. His mother died shortly after he was born. His father was around. He was given to the care of another relative at a fairly young age. And then he took up with a woman who was sort of his patron and otherwise in and out of a lot of different situations. Did a lot of things that apparently he didn't feel good about. Among other things, he gave away the children that he had with his mistress, which I don't know what he was thinking at the time, but certainly later on, that was something that he regretted doing. So, as I said, Voltaire's kind of a piece of work. He's got a lot of anger. He's got a lot of anger from when he was young and times were hard and everybody wasn't necessarily nice to him. He doesn't like, rich people and high status people kind of looking at him. He's got that edge. He doesn't like the gaze of the other because he's a tough guy, kind of a little bit of a street guy. He clearly feels burned. And so when we're looking at Rousseau's thinking, I get the sense that we're looking at, among other things, the manifesto of someone who feels burned and wants to talk about what it is that he feels sort of burned in. Nietzsche's kind of this way. Rousseau's very much this way. So he talks about, as I say, in Emile and other places, he talks about early childhood education, which he thinks is really important. He thinks it's terrible to neglect children. Of course he does. But he goes further and he says that civilization and culture, actually, it's right now it's this great celebration all across the Baroque century and across the Enlightenment, the rise of rationalism, the rise of empiricism, the rise of the nation state, the rise of colonialism and empire. And it's this sort of forward-looking, progressive kind of theory of history that everybody has, that everything's getting better and better. And Rousseau is the skunk at the garden party. Rousseau doesn't think everything's getting better and better. In fact, Rousseau thinks civilization and culture ruin individuality. Rousseau chooses to go live in a very austere Calvinist community in Switzerland, where he even goes so far as to protest the building of a acting theater there, of a playhouse, because he thinks that civilization's bad for people, so he's pretty hardcore. And it's almost, I mean, in the middle of 18th century Paris, where Benjamin Franklin is the ambassador from the United States and David Hume is the charge d'affaires of the British embassy. And you've got all these people, Voltaire, and you've got all the painters, and you've got, and Rousseau is plunked down in that scene. It's about, it's the most opposite thing you could possibly say to these people, was that you thought that actually civilization was bad for people, and notably and interestingly, that people were better in the first place. Hobbes has essentially a negative picture of human nature. Hobbes thinks that if you take government away from people, they'll just start killing each other over the food. Rousseau is the reverse. Rousseau thinks that the problem is that we start off something very perfect, very sort of godly, and then through, again, this gaze of the other, it's because of other people. Again, Rousseau, he's so wild. It's really, he really thinks that when I interact with, I'm fine. Here's Rousseau's sense. Here's what Rousseau's saying, that look, I'm fine by myself. I do okay. But as soon as I get with these other people and we start getting these head games, and then it starts to be like this ego thing, like who's better. And now we're like jockeying for power and we want things from each other. And so that's really what original sin is for Rousseau. Really, it's just other people. Like Sartre says, hell is other people. And that's Rousseau all the way. He thinks that because we're all put together here in this big city, in this big civilization, now we're all competing on this kind of constructed standard with each other. And that's why we're all such a bunch of assholes. Really, that's basically Rousseau's. And so Rousseau also gives something, a trope, a cultural trope that's got very long legs. And that's the sort of myth of the noble savage. It's very patronizing, right? But it's typically Rousseauian, coming again at the end of the 18th century, the peak of colonialism. I'm going to talk about slavery in the next video. I'm going to do that political video for you. So here he is. Saying, but really those people, the savages, the undeveloped people out in Asia and Africa and all these places that we're colonizing and conquering right now and enslaving, but those people, they're pure, they're good, they're actually wise, and you've all heard this trope before. This is a really common trope. This is a really common trope of the young adult who's got newfound resentments, kind of coping with the big bad world. Rousseau says, look, this is all because of, you're all corrupt and jaded, all you people. And of course, Rousseau extends that to things like private property. And Rousseau has a sophisticated analysis of language and the origins of language that also is consistent with what he says. Latter day Marxists will say not only then that capitalism is unfair in terms of the distribution of wealth, but also there's this kind of psychological, it's more bougie kind of line that says, well, and also we're alienated, we're not able to realize our true selves because of the distortions of the system, the distortions of property, of the family and the state and so on. And yeah, Rousseau agrees with that. That's Rousseau. So with Rousseau also we can see some early sort of socialist thought, a lot of communitarian thought coming up in the early 1800s. And that's also something that Rousseau plugs into. Just a fascinating person. That's The Social Contract. He also has a book called Emile, and he has a number of other important writings. Rousseau has a substantial. Diderot. So we talked about Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and now finally we're going to talk about Denis Diderot. Like Montesquieu, someone kind of forgotten. Voltaire and Rousseau, very famous, very widely read. Voltaire always kind of more famous than read, maybe. Rousseau maybe a little more substantially studied by academia today, but that's just my impression, and maybe a little more substantial. Diderot was hired originally with a partner to translate an English dictionary, Encyclopedie, but that project really pretty soon got out of control. And he conceived a project, it seemed reasonable at the time, to try to make an encyclopedia with all the world's knowledge. And interestingly and significantly, Diderot very much thought about that in terms of engineering and technical knowledge. Diderot would have exhausting regimens for himself where he would go to a factory, say that was manufacturing something, spend the day learning about the equipment, how it was made, how it worked, drawing pictures of it, writing descriptions of it. And then he'd go and write the entry for the encyclopedia. The idea was to share all the technical knowledge, all the engineering knowledge in the encyclopedia so everyone could have access to it. Kind of like a open source or all that. He was into the spread of information. He understood the importance of the spread of information is what I'm trying to say. This was a big success. This was very much in the spirit of the times. And when reading about Diderot in the encyclopedia, there, he gets censored. There are some big defeats he has when they actually find his stuff and edit it and censor it. And he's always running around, hiding in the night and all this kind of stuff. But it's also true that he had friends in high places. One of the highest ranking officials in the king's court was actually the person who was hiding the manuscripts of the encyclopedia at one point from the censors so that they wouldn't be destroyed. I mean, and Madame Pompadour and other very, very high ranking and high status people approved of the encyclopedia. Well, at the same time, though, the church, of course, despised the encyclopedia, as you can imagine. And so the royal court was always torn about that. So it's this big cat and mouse game, and there's lots of interesting stories about it if you like that sort of thing. Atheistic and democratic overtones. Catherine the Great, very generous with Diderot. Diderot was a very high status person, as I say in the last point on this slide there. He was also credited as a reviewer at the salons, the annual showings of paintings in Paris, as someone who also really sort of reinvigorated the painting scene, the art scene. And being the art critic in Paris, they say there was really no small thing at all. He was very, very famous. And Diderot also writes a number of interesting novels and novelettes that are philosophical. He's interested in dreaming, and he's interested in other philosophical issues as well. All right. So let's talk about the encyclopedia itself. 4,000 subscribers in 1757, which started to make the authorities a little bit nervous. That's a really lot. Subscribers, so it got published, monthly, and you got your new bit of it, sort of like a magazine. Formally suppressed in 1959, but as they say, that didn't necessarily mean it was completely outlawed or underground. It had its supporters. So what were the problems for the encyclopedia? What made the encyclopedia revolutionary? first, it was completely devoted to the new natural science. So it took a side on that. If the church said, hey, watch out for the new natural science, make sure you cleared it with us. We've got a list here of the books you can read and the books that you cannot. And the Encyclopedia voted very decisively on that. No, we're with science. We're going to give the people all the science that we can. We're going to give the people all the science. In fact, it was literally what they wanted to do. As well as, remember again, the rise of colonialism and lots of information and all kinds of stuff flooding in from other parts of the world. And the Encyclopedia also working very hard to keep up with all of that, and including tales of governments and societies in other parts of the world. So a big thorn in the side for the church that way. An interesting thing about the Encyclopedia and about Diderot, I mentioned his going to the factories and so on, it really celebrated the working class. When we look at paintings of these centuries, the 18th century, the 19th century, and we look at French Impressionism, we see the painters painting ordinary people, working class people, street scenes. And this is significant because it's celebrating ordinary people and working people. The Encyclopedia did the same thing, and the trades and the class and the crafts. And so this idea that, again, industry, the nobility and the landed gentry didn't live on industry, they lived on sort of their titled position in the world. But here was the Encyclopedia sort of celebrating people who kind of got it together and figured out how to make a factory and make the spools run and that sort of stuff. And of course, this is the run up to the Industrial Revolution, which will be centered in England at the end of the century and the beginning of the next. So it was scientific, it was middle class, and it also was democratic. It championed the new liberal social theory. In particular, Rousseau and Diderot eventually had a falling out, but Rousseau and Diderot were close, and Rousseau wrote articles also for the Encyclopedia with his ideas that he had expressed in his book, The Social Contract. So, so the Encyclopedia really quite striking that way. And I think you can see, again, you think about the Encyclopedia and then Voltaire is to appreciate the success. The Diderot and his Encyclopedia and Voltaire and sort of his promotion of his ideas and himself, they won. They won that sort of battle of hearts and minds over enough of the educated classes and the populist political classes of France that they sort of defined a secular Republican French Republic, France. And so this is really where a lot of it, I mean, when you look at the French Revolution itself, it's awfully messy, but there are larger forces. And so I think this intellectual history of the 18th century in France is critical for understanding those events. Okay, so that's a little bit of the history of the Philosophes and this intellectual ferment in Paris in the 1700s, a wonderful, wonderful scene where all kinds of characters and all kinds of things going on. So great history, great art history, great intellectual and political history in 18th century France. And so we'll stick with this for, we'll stick with France for one more round. I'm going to talk about some more painting. And as I say, I'm going to talk about the revolution and what happens in France in the 18th century a bit, and some other things. We're going to talk about England too. All right, anyway, I'll see you next week. Don't forget to look at the